Okay guys, so welcome to our first ever lesson under our course, Intermediate Accounting 3. For our first discussion, we will talk about Chapter 1, which is Accounting for Provisions, Contingencies, and Other Liabilities. So let's start. Okay, so for our learning objectives, first learning objective natin is to recall the definition of liabilities. Second, distinguish provision from contingent liabilities by applying the recognition criteria for liabilities. Then third, define contingent asset and its recognition criteria. Then last, to account for different non-financial liabilities such as liability for bonuses, taxes, warranties, premium claims, discount vouchers, gift certificate, deposits, and dividend. So let's start. Okay, so let's have a quick review of the definition of liabilities based on your basic accounting subject. According to International Accounting Standard Board, liabilities are present obligations of the entity arising from past events, the settlement of which is expected to result in an outflow from the entity of resources embodying economic benefits. So for us to familiarize with the definition of liabilities even more, so I separated them into three parts. First part is that it should arise from past events. So meaning we cannot just record a liability just because you want to. There should be a source document or source transaction before we can record a liability. And that source should be coming from past events. Second, it should be a present obligation. So meaning future obligations are not included. So there should be a present obligation. Then the last part is it must be settled in the future. If it will not settled in the future, then this transaction should not be converted or recorded under liabilities even there is a past event and there is a present obligation. Okay, so let's have a little illustration how to identify if the specific transaction is considered as a liability transaction. So I have here 6 transactions na ating sasagutan. Then the requirement is to identify if it is a past event, present obligation, and it will be settled in the future. If the 3 elements are present, then the transaction is considered as a liability transaction. So let's start. So first transaction is the signing of employment contract by new employee. So first question natin, is this a past event? So the answer is no, this is not a past event since the employee is not yet rendering the services required. Then meron na po ba tayong present obligation? Answer is no, because we can only have a present obligation if the employee has already rendered the services required. Then will be settled in the future? The answer is also no since we still don't have present obligation. So therefore, ang liability po natin ay wala. So no liability should be recognized on the first transaction. Second transaction, receipt of goods ordered from a supplier. So as you can see, the goods were already received. Since the goods were already received as past event, so yes po ang sagot natin dyan. So, since the goods were already received, do we have a present obligation? The answer is yes. So meron na po tayong obligation to pay our seller since the risk and reward were already transferred to us as a buyer. Then, do you think it will be settled in the future? The answer is definitely yes. Since all the elements are present, then liabilities must be recognized. Then third one, declaration of shared dividends on ordinary share. So meron po ba tayong past event? So ang past event natin is yung declaration ng shared dividends. So I think it is inaral na natin to sa ating corporate accounting wherein if there is a declaration of dividend, then it is considered as past event and kailangan na po natin mag-recognize niya ng liability. The next criteria is the present obligation. So since we already declared the dividend, therefore, there is already an present obligation. Will be settled in the future? Yes. So once it is recorded as declared, then we have to record liability and after a period of time, it will be recorded to, it will be issued to our shareholders. Then of course, it will be settled in the future. Since all elements are present, then liability must be recognized. Third, receipt of goods to be sold for the account of consignor. So since in this event, we are the consignee. So as we all know, under PAS 2 or accounting for inventory. So as a consignee, we are not obliged to record an inventory account since we are the risk and reward still with the consignor. So as to past event, yes, we have a past event since we have received goods from our consignor. But for present obligation, the answer is no, because we have no present obligation to pay our consignor. Why? We are not required to pay our consignor yet because uh, we are just required to sell it to our client, and whatever the proceeds should be remitted to our consignor. Since we are not required to pay our consignor yet, once kailangan pa nating mabenta or we need the item to be sold before we pay our consignor. Therefore, we don't have a present obligation. And will be settled in the future? No, since we don't have present obligation yet, then wala muna tayong babayarin sa ating consignor. Then, since two elements were not met, then liabilities must not be recognized. Then, fifth transaction, receipt of cash from customers of goods to be delivered next month. As to past event, the answer is yes. Uh, then for present obligation, the answer is also yes because the goods are not yet delivered to our client. So our obligation is not to pay cash to our client but to deliver the goods next month. So will be settled in the future, yes, but in the form of delivery of goods. Since all elements are present, then liabilities must be recognized. Last part, the company allotted budget for possible violation of breach of contract. So past event, so as you can see, there's just a possibility that the violation might be committed. So since we are not sure if the violation is committed or not, then there is no past event kasi nga it talks about the future. Then past event is no. Present obligation po, since the obligation will happen in the future, there is no present obligation. The answer is no. Yan. Then how about future settlement? Since future settlement pa yan, so ang answer still no kasi nga hindi pa naman po yun nangyayari yung transaction. So as you can see, wala pong na-meet na criteria. So therefore, the last transaction is not considered as a liability transaction. Okay, so let's now proceed to the next topic, which all about provisions. So before we proceed to the accounting for provision, I just want you to know that provision is a kind of liability. Liability because it meets the requirement which is defined by the International Accounting Standard Board, such as arises from past event, then it's also a present obligation, and it also be settled in the future with some uncertainties or defects. So these are the defects of the provision. So under provision, there is uncertainty as to the date of payment and as to the exact amount of obligation. So in liability, we have accrued expense and we also have provision. If the three requirements above were met by the transaction which is arising from past event, and there is a present obligation and it will be settled in the future, and we are certain as to the date of payment and the exact of obligation, and that transaction is considered as accrued expense. However, if the transaction meet the requirements of arising from past event, there is a present obligation and it will be settled in the future, but we are uncertain as to the date of payment and the exact amount of obligation, that transaction is not considered as accrued expense but as a provision, which is also a liability. And according to our accounting standard, provision is governed by the accounting standard IAS 37. Okay, so under IAS 37, which is provision, so IAS 37 provided three requirements before a provision can be recognized. So the first requirement is that the entity should have a present obligation. It may be legal or constructive arising from past event. So since it is also a requirement for liability, of course, this is also a requirement for provision because provision is a kind of liability. However, under provision, obligation may arise through legal or constructive means. What do you mean by legal and what do you mean by constructive? So under legal, meron po tayo diyang arises from contract, legislation, and other operation of law. Example of obligation arises from legal means or contract is that the guarantee, di ba, or the guarantor. For example, you act as a guarantor to a other company which is the guarantee, and that guarantee borrowed money from the bank. Then, in case of default by the guarantee, so ikaw po yung mag-shoulder ng payment or ikaw yung magbabayad doon sa bangko or doon sa ating lender. So, in that case, yung obligation mo arises from contract. Another example is legislation. So, example of legislation and other operation of law is that related to environmental concern. Let's say, for example, the company violated some environmental laws that will affect the environment. So, in effect, the company may be charged to the court and may be mandated or may be obligated to pay something to the government as a damages. So in that case, that obligation arises from legislation or other operation of law. Another source of obligation, which is constructive obligation that will result to a recognition of provision, is through constructive obligation. Constructive obligation arises with established pattern of past practices. So best example of constructive obligation is the provision for bonuses. So alam naman natin ang bonuses ay depende yan sa prerogative ng management. However, to follow the rule of conservatism or yung ating prudence, so most of the company is nagre-recognize na tayo ng provision beforehand before the release of the bonuses. So the obligation arises not from contract or not from legal manner, but is based on the best past practice of the management. So if this criteria were met, which is part of the present obligation, then next dun tayo sa next criteria, which is it is probable that an outflow of resources embodying economic benefits will be required to settle the obligation, which is alam naman natin yan, if there's a liability, there should be a probability that an outflow of resources must flow to the entity, which is in the form of cash or other kind of asset, or kaya naman ay rendering of services to satisfy the needs of the liability account. The last requirement, which is the amount can there should be a reliable estimate can be made of the amount of obligation. Although as I discussed earlier, pag sinabi po nating provision, there is uncertainty as to the timing of payment and the amount to be paid, but there should be a reliable estimate that will be made in order to record the provision. Kasi if there is no reliable estimate, although it qualifies to be a liability, hindi po yun i-record under provision. It will be recorded under contingent liability, which is di-discuss natin mamaya. Ulitin ko lang po, an entity should have a present obligation or legal constructive arising from past event. It is probable that an outflow of resources embodying economic benefits will be required to settle the obligation, and there should be a reliable estimate that can be made of the amount of obligation. If this criteria ay na-meet natin, then that transaction should be recorded under provision. Okay, so let's have an example of provision. So let's say SM Mall has been sued by a customer for 500,000 in damages because her child was injured in December 2018 while riding an escalator that stopped suddenly. The child was hurt when he tripped and fell. Legal counsel feels that the child is partially at fault, but it is probable that the lawsuit will be settled for 50,000 to 100,000 pesos, 70,000 being the most likely amount. So the question here, do you think the transaction is considered as a provision? So let's have a test. Based on the guidelines that we have discussed earlier, di ba? So for it to be recorded as provision, dapat mag-qualify muna siya doon as a liability. So first, it is considered as past event. The answer is yes because of the event that was happened in the past, which is the injured happened to a child. And there is a lawsuit or pending lawsuit that is happening right now. So therefore, check po tayo doon sa past event. Do you think there is a present obligation? The answer is also yes because we are obliged to answer and there is a probability that the obligation will be confirmed. So actually, there is a present obligation, but the possibility or the probability of that the confirmation is not yet certain. But based on the statement provided by the legal counsel, it feels that there is a probability or it is probable that the lawsuit will be settled. So ibig sabihin po, malaki ang tsansa na tayo ay magbabayad ah, sa ating customer, which is yun nga yung customer na nag-file ng lawsuit against us. So, ibig sabihin po, na-meet niya yung requirements ng liability, which is past event, present obligation, and will be settled in the future. However, as you can see, there is still uncertainty as to the date of payment and as to amount. Bakit uncertain as to the date of payment? Because there's as of the based on the statement, wala pa pong verdict si korte. So dahil wala pong verdict si court, therefore wala pa po tayong date of payment. As to amount, wala pa rin po namang nakalagay kasi nga wala pa namang final verdict si court. Although it qualifies under a liability due to uncertainties as to the date of payment as to amount, then it is not considered as accrued expense, but as a provision. So another test to record it as a provision, dapat daw there should be a reliable estimate of the amount. So based on the statement provided, ang hinihingi ng ating customer is 500,000 pesos. But based on the recommendation of the legal counsel, ang babayaran lang daw natin is within 100 to 50,000 pesos. But 70,000 being the most likely amount. So based on the statement, we can say that the best amount or the best estimate is not 500,000, not 50,000, and not 100,000, but 70,000 pesos. So therefore, 70,000 pesos should be the amount of provision. So what will be the journal entry? Ang journal entry po natin should look like this. So debit ka lang ng estimated loss and lawsuit will be part of the statement of comprehensive income. Then credit ka ng provision for pending lawsuit, which is part of our liability account. And the amount should be recorded should be 70,000 pesos, which is the best estimate based on our legal counsel. Okay? So let's now proceed to the next topic, which is contingent liability. So contingent liability is a possible obligation arising from past events whose existence will be confirmed only by the occurrence or non-occurrence of some uncertain future events not fully within the entity's control. So basically, if the liability is not an accrued expense or a provision, then it must be classified under contingent liability. Contingent liability is not recorded in the book because the possibility or the likelihood that the liability will be incurred is only possible. So if we will going to translate the possibility into rate, ano lang po yan, less than 50%. Since the likelihood is less than 50%, then the liability must not be recognized. So although it arises from past event, but the confirmation or the occurrence of the obligation is still uncertain or the likelihood is not below 50%. So therefore, hindi po yan i-record. So another terminology for contingent liability is that it is a present obligation that arises from past event but it's not recognized because it is not probable that an outflow of resources embodying economic benefit will be required to settle the obligation, or the amount of the obligation cannot be measured with sufficient reliability. So although it qualifies the criteria of present obligation and it also arises from past event, if it is not probable that an outflow of resources will be required to settle the obligation and the obligation or the amount of the obligation cannot be measured sufficient, then that transaction is considered as contingent liability at hindi rin po yan i-record sa ating libro. Okay, to summarize, we can use this table in order to determine if the specific transaction is an accrued expense, a provision, or a contingent liability, and what will be the accounting treatment to each of the following cases. So, meron tayo diyang virtually certain, probable, possible, remote. It is translated into a percentage for us to easily understand. So, if the probability is virtually certain, so basically, ano lang yan, more than 90%. So if it is more than 90%, then we can say that the transaction is considered as accrued expense. And since it is an accrued expense, it requires a journal entry. Then next, if the item is is probable, if we say probable more than 50% but not more than 90%, then since the probability is more than 50%, then it is considered as a provision. Then a provision must be recognized. If you are recognizing a provision, so we just need to debit an expense account or an estimated cost of loss, and the other on the credit side is an estimated cost of liability. But if the probability is only possible, if we say possible less than 50%, but not less than 5%, then it is considered as a contingent liability. So, ano yung gagawin natin if the probability is only possible, not accrued expense and not provision, but just a contingent liability? If it is just a contingent liability, all we need to do is to disclose the statement on our as notes to financial statement. Then, kapag na-disclose na natin siya dun sa ating notes to financial statement, so okay na yon. Then, we just need to monitor. Baka kasi on next year, from being possible, it will become probable. However, if the probability of the transaction is remote, which is converted into less than 5%, then that contingent liability should be ignored.